Reinhardt, after 7 years, is back with vengeance with a brand new Arcane and a pure FA that gives him the ever so beloved player phase Brave effect that he is so well known for. The Arcane is definitely the main point of the video, but I needed an intro and I didn't really have anything else, so yeah, there you go. Anyway, Arcane Thunder. Brand new Blue Tome Arcane, which is a lot more speed oriented comparatively to Euphoria. You know what to expect at this point, let's just get right into it. Arcane Thunder, it is a slaying tome that grants Spectrum 5, special cooldown charge +1 per attack, aka the breath effect, lull speed and res, and speed based no follow-up. With the final effect in particular, you'll pretty much just jump to the idea that this is a speed-based weapon, which makes sense. You get no follow-up based on your speed, even though everything else is free. In this scenario, I'm probably going to agree with it as well. Last time when it came to Arcane Therema, I was more on the side that you could use this with a lot of slower units as well, mainly because you also had defensive properties built into it, including tempo and sabotage, so you could still slap this on pretty much any single unit. That being said, Arcane Thunder being a lot more restrictive, more or less just has to do with the skill inheritance restrictions, whereas a lot of melee units can take advantage of so many skills regardless of their stats spread. This just doesn't happen to be the case here. We also do have the old Arcane Blue Tome and Euphoria, which in my opinion is still a relatively solid option because it still grants you a guaranteed follow-up. You get true damage based on your attack, which can still be used for AoEs, and you get first hit damage reduction. The only real big difference in the grand scheme of things is going to be the true damage that you get out of the weapon, something that you could easily make up for in a lot of newer B slots, including Occultist Strike, because it also grants true damage. I would say for the most part, if you were given the opportunity to use the new Arcane Blue Tome, I would probably take it over Euphoria. The only scenarios I would keep Arcane Euphoria for are the really slow units who aren't as good with Arcane Thunder. Granted, the argument of Brash Assault allowing you to still double through it and get the breath effect is still relatively nice, especially since it also has speed res lull built into it, meaning that your damage output's going to be relatively consistent. I would argue that at this point in the game, with all the skill accessibility these units have, it's not really going to be worth it for most of them, especially for the infantry who have access to natural piercing skills, including Tempo 4 and Magical No Follow. The Flyers and Cavalry also have access to Flared Sparrow and Occultist Strike, which is a nice tool to have for free chip damage and true damage on your B slot. The stark contrast and preference between which unit wants what arcane is a lot more visible comparatively to the other arcanes. And for what it's worth, the speedier units having access to a better arcane that suits their playstyle is definitely going to be a lot better than having to continually go for Euphoria. Now there's just options for everybody regardless of their archetype. Although outside of that, there's just some units that you don't want to give the arcane to regardless. You have your refreshers, you have relatively solid tanks, you have really good nukes, you got units that have niches that can't be replicated otherwise. Some units just have a generally better Arcane Thunder, whether it's because they have no follow-up in it, more stats, other effects that allow them to perform at a much higher level comparatively, or even for some older units that you could argue would rather prefer the Arcane, although it will just ultimately depend. For example, units like Micaiah and Cliff. Micaiah has a guaranteed follow-up tome with stats and first hit damage reduction, but I think the big thing separating her from a lot of the other generics is the armor and cav effectiveness, especially the former, where having armor effectiveness is such a great boon right now. And with Cliff, even though his refund is relatively old, with newer skill additions that we got, such as attack res tempo, you could argue that keeping his PRF is a much more ideal thing because it adds to his defensive pressure. His weapon has Spectrum 9 with built-in guard and true damage based on the foe's attack, so with attack res tempo he can still get shred and prevent specials outright unless A, they're fully charged, or B, the foe has tempo themselves, and that more or less applies to everybody in the keep PRF section. Some of them are just outright better than any of the other inheritables, but some of them also have niches that you could easily make up for by running other skills and could arguably end up performing a lot better because of it. The only units I would still wait for are Guinevere, Ilyana, and Marianne. They should be getting refined within the scope of 1 year, but for what it's worth, Ilyana and Guinevere are near the end of book 4 and Marianne is at the beginning of book 5, so if you didn't want to wait that long, you could still grab Arcane Thunder for Guinevere and Ilyana. Marianne will probably want Arcane Euphoria, but the weapon is so similar that at that point you may as well just keep her PRF anyway. But again, it's extremely straightforward. A lot of the fast ones want the new Arcane, the slower ones want the older Arcane. A lot more cut and dry comparatively to the other Arcanes that we've gotten in the past. Now that being said, if you're looking to build any of these units with the Arcane in mind, you have plenty of options available to you. One of my favorite part about Arcanes like these is the breath effect because it allows for a lot more special manipulation, whether that's with lower cooldown specials such as Flare or even higher cooldown specials such as Aether and Miracle. Miracle strats in particular, while I wouldn't necessarily recommend as a general thing, are some of my favorite personal builds, mainly because it minimizes the issues of initiating combat a lot of the time. With breath built into the weapon, you're going to be able to charge Miracle on the foe's first attack, assuming that they don't have guard or tempo, but you could run tempo yourself and prevent guard effects. After that point, you're just going to have Miracle ready to go, and then you can run finish skills to keep up the threshold and continually keep yourself out of harm's way. But if you're like me and you like special quotes, you could go with something like Aether or Flare. Flare is a lot easier to trigger, and in my opinion, it's a lot better to run on your infantry just because of the ease of getting it off. Even if the foe has a guard effect, you're going to be able to get it off on your second hit. You could also go with Times Pulse and a 2 cooldown special if you just want to spam specials that way. Alongside finish, you'll also get a bunch of healing and true damage, and everything else will more or less just be complementary to either the weapon or just your damage output. Tempo 4 reduces damage reduction properties, which is always a great benefit to have. Desperation 4 means that you don't necessarily have to worry about taking hits, especially since the weapon doesn't have any sort of damage reduction properties. You won't have to run remote, even though it is an option. Desperation 4 just requires that you move at least 2 spaces, or if you're below 99% HP, which is easy enough to accomplish. Wind Sweep and Water Sweep can be there to prevent any sort of counterattack. Brash Assault for damage reflection. Sabotage if you have a good res stat. And Special Spiral if you do want to spam stuff like Aether or higher cooldown specials, although in my opinion, attack res tempo is probably the better option, not only because of the null guard effect, but also because the shred is a lot more consistent. Otherwise, the rest of the slots are just there to be complementary. Bonus Doubler for stats, Fatal Smoke to bypass miracle effects, Times Pulse for charging specials faster, Tier 4 ploys, etc, etc. Moving past the infantry options, we also have the armors who can still run stuff such as Aether, Armored Skills, and Miracle. Armored Flow and Beacon are relatively standard for shrugging off special damage. They do also provide damage output from your defense and res respectively. If you do want to take advantage of the charge effect from the weapon, it also allows for more consistent healing if you're going to be running Special Fighter. One of the things the armors definitely struggle with here are B slot variety, because outside the Guard 4, their best options at this time still have overlap with the Arcane. Even though that isn't the worst thing by any means, it's just something that you're not going to be able to take advantage of as much because it already exists in the weapon. Savvy Fighter 4 still gives you protection from brave attacks and can pair well with the likes of Miracle. Special Fighter 4 works relatively well with Armored Flow and Beacon because you're able to retaliate with an instant special most of the time. Generally, healing on specials is a lot better on your first attack because that's when the foe is going to have the most HP present. Otherwise, it's just far save, bond skills, squad A seals that boost your HP. It will depend on which armor you use, although we don't really have a lot of blue tome armor options. Generally speaking, you're probably just going to be boosting HP, attack, and speed. And then the A slot is going to be where you get the most variety, whether it's inflicting guard, removing any sort of bonuses from the foe, removing your own armor weakness, unity, stance, etc. And by the by, you may have been seeing this Eliana float around on the screen, and you may be wondering why she's here, even though I have her in the Arcane Euphoria option. And that's just because I think it's funny, and I wanted to put a third build. It's something that you could just replicate with Euphoria, and it's arguably better that you do it with Euphoria, because it's probably going to be a lot cheaper. But for any of the Ilyana fans out there, if you wanted to run them as a far save, well, this is probably the best option you got that isn't related to Arcane Euphoria. The new Arcane with Miracle and Hardy Bearing. Hardy Bearing is just there to prevent Desperation Sweep so that you can at least charge Miracle in the process. You wouldn't run this build on a fast unit because there's just going to be outspeeding, and especially for units like Lin and Nino, they have so much speed, and the weapon grants low speed res, so you can make speed checks way more consistently. It's not something you have to worry about as much, but yeah, as far as armors are concerned, they don't have a lot, but at the very least there isn't any sort of skill inheritance paralysis going on. And other than that, you just have the Flyer and Cav options, which are more or less going to be running the same thing. The only difference is really going to be Unity on Flyers, which in my opinion, you're not really going to be running on a Cav unit, and the C options. A lot of the Flyers and Cavs can do true damage and free damage stuff with Occultist Strike and Flared Sparrow. You could always run Remote Sparrow Brash Assault sets if you want to reflect so much damage, and with Arcane Thunder's Breath effect built into it, you could get a really hard-hitting Aether or even Luna or Ruptured Sky depending on your preference ready out of the gate. Aether is probably going to be best just because you'll get a lot more consistent healing out of it, even though it is going to be on the second hit. Sabotage and Tier 4 ploys are also solid options if they have the res stat. We also have the brand new Speed Res Far Trace 4 B slot, which grants a minimum of Canto 1 regardless of how much you move, which is a really solid upgrade just for moving around and setting up terrain such as the Flared one or even Miasma, even though I wouldn't recommend the Miasma one just because it has overlap with the the Arcane, and the other stats that you would be nullifying really doesn't make that big of a difference for their archetypes. You also have Desperation 4, which is probably a better option for them in particular because of how much they can move around with relative ease. But otherwise, it's going to be more or less the same stuff. Stack up your respective stats, run Flared Sparrow, damage reduction skills, flyers can run Guidance, Oath, Hold, cabs can run Insight and Menace. Although the one thing I definitely appreciate on Cavalry the most now is Defense Res Smoke, mostly because of the upgrade of Far Trace 4. Now you're going to be able to get a minimum of Canto 1, so now you could run away and still provide a good extended amount of movement for any of your allies to move in. Whereas before, you were definitely a lot more limited in how far you can move because you wouldn't be able to get any sort of Canto after combat if you extended all your movement. But otherwise, it's just a lot of player phase oriented skills. As big of a shock as that may come, which is probably not a big shock because this is a very player phase oriented tome. You know, outside of the armors who are extremely enemy phase, you're generally going to be running a lot of player phase skills, so any sort of combination or skill that you may have readily available, if you wanted to give it to any sort of cav, flyer, infantry, armor, these are probably some of the best inheritable options that you have currently for this tome. Maybe we'll get better ones in the future, but at this time, I would recommend these skills if you have them available to you. But other than that, that's probably going to be about it for the Arcane Thunder Tome guide thingy majiggy. I don't know. You know how I said I didn't have an opener? I don't really have a closer, but hey, I'll do the standard questionnaire and look over the comments. If you do plan to summon for this tome, let me know who you plan to give it to, because I'm very curious on who you plan on giving it to. But until then, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.